Welcome to the U.S. English Lab. Let's master your English together.
Usually, when you look at a map, there's this underlying expectation of just absolute, undeniable precision.
Right, yeah. It's an engineering marvel.
Exactly. You pull up an app on your phone, the GPS locks in with satellites orbiting the literal planet. You see that little blue dot, and the interface just points and definitively says, there you are.
It's entirely binary. You are either at the location or you aren't.
Right.
I mean, your destination is exactly 4.2 miles away. The ETA is 14 minutes, and the traffic delay is calculated down to the literal second.
Yeah. You just take 3 right turns, merge onto the highway, and you arrive. It's a clean, totally friction-free cognitive experience.
Right.
But,
yeah.
And here's the thing, when you step into the world of mastering a new language, or really when you start chasing any massive abstract life ambition, suddenly that GPS machine is just entirely broken.
Oh, completely broken.
Well, the landscape isn't gridded anymore, the water is murky, you don't have a blue dot telling you if you are actually moving closer to fluency or if you are just, wandering aimlessly in the woods.
Which is an incredibly uncomfortable place for the human brain to be.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we are biologically wired to crave visible progress. So when the environment is ambiguous, our motivation it plummets.
It totally drops off. And that biological friction is exactly why we are jumping into this stack of sources for today's deep dive.
It's a fascinating stack today.
It really is. Because there is a hidden mechanism, a cognitive cheat code, basically to clear that murky water. We are looking at this bizarre but brilliant intersection of cognitive psychology papers, linguistics research on second language acquisition, and then wait for it, advanced YouTube script writing guides.
Right, the retention optimization stuff.
Yeah, and real-world case studies from English educators. Our mission for you today is to dissect how we talk about dreams and goals in English. But to truly master the vocabulary, we actually have to reverse engineer the very science of how the human brain absorbs information.
We are essentially exploring the architecture of ambition.
I love that phrase, architecture of ambition.
Right, because the words we use to define what we want aren't just labels. They actually dictate the neural pathways we use to pursue those things. And the sources point out a really stark foundational difference between a dream and a goal.
Okay, let's pull that apart because I think people use those words interchangeably all the time, which is, it's a massive linguistic trap.
It is a huge trap.
Based on the ESL presentation we reviewed, a dream is categorized as this really broad, highly emotional aspiration. It's like the ultimate realization of a desire. But crucially, dreams are often entirely disconnected from your current reality.
Right. They are inherently unfocused. A dream basically relies on a multitude of external factors miraculously aligning in your favor.
Yes.
It's the vision of standing on the summit of the mountain, but without, any consideration for the oxygen levels or the weather or the actual climbing gear required to get there.
Whereas a goal is the exact opposite. A goal is anchored in reality. It is a specific, actionable, short-term target that involves variables that are under your direct personal control. If the dream is the summit of the mountain, the goal is simply deciding to put your left boot 12 inches in front of your right boot on the current stretch of trail.
Which fundamentally changes your psychological posture.
How so?
Well, when you operate purely on dreams, you are in a state of passive wishing. You're hoping the universe just hands you the outcome. But when you convert a dream into a goal, you take on active responsibility. And this is where the SMART framework comes in.
Okay, so whenever I hear someone bring up SMART goals, my eyes immediately start to glaze over.
Right, because it sounds like corporate middle management speak.
Exactly. We've all seen the acronym on some whiteboard, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely. But when you look at it through the lens of linguistics rather than HR training, it's actually a psychological trick, isn't it?
It really is.
It's a framework to force your brain to use active verbs.
That is the perfect way to look at it. The framework completely strips away the passive language of longing.
Okay, give me an example.
So you stop saying, I dream of being fluent in English someday.
Right.
Which is a statement of identity and desire, sure, but it's completely devoid of action. Instead, the framework forces you to construct a sentence like, I will learn and actively use 50 new idioms by the end of this month by listening to audio content for 20 minutes every morning.
Wow, yeah. You've moved from a state of being to a state of doing. You've taken this invisible aspiration and made it a visible, trackable metric.
And that transition is deeply embedded in the actual idioms native English speakers use. The language itself provides this whole menu of phrases that map perfectly onto the spectrum of passive dreaming versus active goal setting.
Okay, let's get into those chunks of English vocabulary, starting with the positive aspirational idioms, because these are the phrases that build momentum.
Right.
You have dream big, which is the classic encouragement to not artificially limit your aspirations. Then you have reach for the stars, which takes it a step further.
Right. It's aiming for something incredibly difficult, acknowledging the vast distance between where you are and where you want to be.
And when you eventually hit that target, the language rewards you if the dream come true. It is that perfect moment reality finally intersects with your highest hopes.
We also see this applied to external circumstances, like a dream ticket.
Oh, I love that one.
Yeah.
A dream ticket is used to describe the absolute ideal combination of people or things. You hear it a lot in politics, right? Those two running for office together, that's a dream ticket. It implies a synergy that feels almost too good to be true.
But English is equally, if not more robust when it comes to describing ambitions that go wrong or are just simply delusional.
It has a built-in reality check mechanism.
It really does.
The negative idioms are where the psychology really shines for me. You have living in a dream world, describing someone who aggressively refuses to accept the actual constraints of their situation.
Right.
Or having dreams of grandeur. That's a fascinating one because it doesn't just mean aiming high.
No, it implies a literal delusion of self-importance.
Yes.
It's this inflated sense of reality where the person believes they're already on the summit while they are still sitting in their car in the parking lot.
And then we have broken dreams, which is the visceral, emotional aftermath of those hopes being completely shattered.
It's very dramatic.
But linguistically, the most interesting idiom in the sources, for me at least, is pipe dream. A pipe dream is defined as an unrealistic hope or a fantasy that is highly unlikely to ever be achieved.
The historical context of pipe dream is wild, too.
Oh, totally. It originates from the late 19th century, referring to the literal fantasies and hallucinations people would experience while smoking an opium pipe.
Wow.
Yeah. It denotes an ambition that is entirely disconnected from reality, fueled by, like, an artificial high.
Which actually maps perfectly onto the neuroscience of ambition.
How so?
Well, when you talk about a massive dream without any actionable goals attached to it, your brain releases a spike of dopamine.
Wait, really? Just from talking about it?
Yeah. Just from talking about it. You get the neurological reward of achieving the goal just by fantasizing about it. It is, quite literally, a linguistic dopamine high. You get the rush without doing any of the work.
But I want to challenge the purely negative connotation of this, especially in the context of modern entrepreneurship.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I take my business idea to an investor and they tell me this is just a pipe dream, historically that's an insult.
Right.
That is them telling me my idea is an opium hallucination.
Right.
But in today's startup culture, where the entire point is to disrupt established industries, isn't owning a pipe dream almost a badge of honor?
You know, you are identifying a massive shift in contextual nuance there. In the traditional sense, yes, it's a dismissal, it's a conversational stop sign.
Yeah.
However, in Silicon Valley culture, if you aren't chasing a pipe dream, you aren't thinking big enough. Taking a derogatory term and turning it into a mission statement is a rebellious flex.
I love that. Rebellious flex.
It's saying you perceive this as a hallucination because you are bound by current reality, but I am going to build the infrastructure to make it real.
It's reclaiming the insult. It reminds me of how we use sarcastic idioms to enforce social reality. If someone says, I'm going to be a billionaire by next Tuesday, the natural conversational response is, in your dreams.
Right. Sarcasm acts as a sort of social immune system.
Exactly.
In your dreams is a socially acceptable way to indicate that someone's desire is not just unlikely, but laughably impossible based on their current actions.
So to navigate all of this, to actually build that infrastructure, we have to look at a few phrasal verbs related to planning. Because mastering conversational English isn't just about big idioms.
No, not at all.
It's about the connective tissue of phrasal verbs. We have to figure out, which is the active process of calculating or solving the problem.
Then there is to reckon on. This is vital for setting realistic goals. It means to confidently rely on or calculate a future event. For example, you can't reckon on a sudden viral video to fund your entire business. It forces you to look at the probabilities, not just the possibilities.
And finally, to drum into. This means to teach or drive something into someone's mind through relentless, repetitive force.
Which is the perfect pivot point, honestly.
Why is that?
Because drumming it in represents the darkest, most ineffective era of education. If we want to understand how to permanently wire this vocabulary, or really any complex information into the human brain, we have to dismantle the way we were all taught in school.
So how do we move from what we are learning to the actual biological mechanics of how we acquire it? Because if I just, stare at a list of these idioms, pipe dream, dream big, reckon on my brain might hold them for a vocabulary test on Friday, but by Monday, they are completely gone.
Right, they just vanish. And to understand why that happens, we have to look at this massive paradigm shift in linguistics, specifically the study of second language acquisition. For decades, the mid-century behaviorist model dominated classrooms. This was the era of B.F. Skinner applied to language.
Oh, man. The era of rote memorization.
Yeah.
Treating human beings like Pavlov's dogs.
Effectively, yes. Behaviorism treated language strictly as a mechanical stimulus response exercise.
Right.
The belief was that you learned by pure imitation and external conditioning. You drill the grammar rule, you get a gold star. You fail the drill, you get a red X. It entirely ignored the internal cognitive processing of the learner.
It's the assumption that the brain is an empty bucket, and if the teacher just pours enough isolated vocabulary words into it, eventually the student will speak a language.
Exactly.
But anyone who has taken 3 years of high school French and can only order a croissant knows the bucket has holes in it.
Exactly. And the linguist Noam Chomsky fundamentally destroyed this behaviorist model. He introduced the concept of the language acquisition device, or the LAD.
The LAD, right.
Chomsky argued, and modern cognitive science totally supports this, that human brains possess an innate biological hardware specifically designed to recognize and generate rule-governed linguistic structures.
So we aren't just empty buckets or tape recorders. We actually have biological machinery waiting to be turned on.
Yes, but the machinery doesn't turn on through drilling. It turns on through exposure to meaning. And this brings us to Stephen Krashen, one of the most influential linguists of the 20th century, and his input hypothesis.
Oh, this is the I+1 stuff, right?
Exactly. Krashen proposed a formula that revolutionized language learning, I+1.
Let's really unpack the math of I+1, because it sounds simple, but the cognitive load theory behind it is profound.
It is. So I represents your current exact level of linguistic competence. It's what you already know effortlessly. The tay+1 represents input, whether that's reading or listening. That is just one incremental step above your current level of understanding. Krashen's core argument is that language is acquired naturally, subconsciously, when you are exposed to comprehensible input at this precise frontier of your knowledge.
So if the input is just I, meaning it's exactly at your level, you are comfortable, but you aren't learning anything new. You are stagnating.
Right.
But if the input is I+10, say, trying to read a medical journal in Japanese, when you only know the alphabet, the cognitive load is so high that your brain completely shuts down. It registers this pure noise.
Yeah.
The high +1 is the friction point where learning actually happens.
Exactly. But Krashen, alongside researcher Benico Mason, refined this even further into the optimal input hypothesis.
Because just being comprehensible isn't enough.
Right. It's not enough to sustain the grueling marathon of acquiring a language. So they established 4 non-negotiable criteria for input. First, as we said, it must be comprehensible. Second, it must be compelling.
Compelling is the secret sauce. The content has to be so narratively engaging, so fascinating on its own merits, that your brain entirely forgets it is processing a foreign language.
Yes. You are no longer studying English. You are just desperate to know how the story ends.
Exactly.
Third, the input must be rich. It cannot be isolated sentences stripped of context, like flashcards. It needs to be embedded in a wide web of narrative and cultural meaning. And fourth, it must be abundant.
Abundant, meaning you can't just get 10 minutes of it a week.
Right.
You need hundreds of hours. So how do we practically manufacture this I+1 environment? The sources bring up an incredible methodology called ALG, automatic language growth, and a specific technique known as crosstalk.
Oh, crosstalk is a radical application of comprehensible input. Picture 2 people sitting down for a conversation. Person A only speaks English. Person B only speaks Spanish.
Okay.
Instead of awkwardly trying to stumble through each other's languages, they both speak their native language.
Wait, if they're both speaking a language the other person doesn't understand, how's that a conversation?
Because they compensate with massive amounts of nonverbal communication.
Oh, I see.
They use exaggerated facial expressions, body language, pointing, drawing pictures on a napkin. They are constantly reading each other for signs of comprehension and adjusting their delivery.
So if I'm the English speaker, I am listening to a stream of Spanish. But because the Spanish speaker is physically acting out what they are saying, I understand the meaning before I understand the words.
Exactly. You bypass the bilingual dictionary in your head.
Right.
There is no cognitive interference where you hear a Spanish word, translate it to English, understand the English, and then try to translate your response back to Spanish. You map the Spanish sound directly to the physical reality being demonstrated.
That makes a lot of sense in a controlled one-on-one environment where someone is like drawing pictures for me. But I want to push back on how this scales.
Okay, sure.
A lot of people claim they learn languages just by watching Netflix. If I go home tonight and binge watch 400 hours of Spanish television without subtitles, am I going to acquire the language, or am I just subjecting myself to a wall of noise?
That is the critical distinction, and the research provides a very specific mathematical threshold for this. Pure noise is never I+1.
Right.
If you are comprehending 0% of the dialogue, your brain cannot build the neural bridges. For text, like reading a novel, linguistic studies show you need an astonishing 98% comprehension rate to naturally acquire the remaining 2% from context.
Wait, 98%?
Yes.
So out of 100 words on a page, I have to already know 98 of them perfectly just to naturally absorb the other two. That is a brutally high barrier to entry.
It is, because text provides 0 nonverbal clues. A word on a page is an arbitrary symbol. But this is where video fundamentally changes the geometry of learning. With video, the required comprehension threshold drops dramatically, down to roughly 80% or 85%.
Oh, because the visual data is acting like the crosstalk partner. The setting, the lighting, the actor's terrified facial expression, the fact that they're holding a prop, all of that is pumping immense amounts of contextual data into your brain.
Precisely. The visual storytelling bridges the semantic gaps. So to answer your question, watching a Spanish TV show will work if the visual narrative is so clear that you can follow the plot even when the dialogue washes over you.
Right.
But if it's an avant-garde film consisting of two people debating philosophy in a dark room with no props, it drops back below the threshold and becomes noise again.
The visual element isn't just an accessory. It is the scaffolding that holds up the language acquisition.
Yeah.
And this transitions beautifully into the real-world case studies the sources provided from Luke's English podcast.
Yes, those were great.
We get to see how actual listeners weaponize this abundant input to achieve fluency.
Because eventually you have to transition from passively comprehending the input to actively producing the output. The brain's understanding of a language is not the same as the mouth's physical ability to speak it.
So let's look at Muslimbek, a listener in South Korea. He didn't just listen to hours of audio. He utilized a brutal, highly active technique called shadowing.
Oh, shadowing is intense.
It is. He would listen to the podcast and attempt to repeat exactly what the speaker was saying in real time, matching the accent, the intonation, and the micropauses.
Right, because shadowing forces the brain to confront the physical reality of language. When you listen, your auditory cortex is doing the work. But when you shadow, you are forcing your motor cortex to fire.
Yeah.
You are physically training the muscles of your tongue, jaw, and vocal cords to produce sounds that do not exist in your native language. The cognitive resistance you feel when doing this is immense, but it rapidly bridges the gap between passive knowledge and active fluency.
Then we have the case study of Naoko, who focused heavily on chunking.
Chunking is so important.
It really is. When she heard a new phrase, she didn't isolate the words. If she heard our idiom pipe dream, she didn't look up pipe and then look up dream. She memorized the entire phrase as a single unbreakable unit of meaning.
Chunking is the bedrock of natural fluency. I mean, native speakers do not construct sentences word by word, applying grammar rules on the fly.
That would take way too long.
Exactly. It requires far too much computational power. Instead, we speak by stringing together prefabricated chunks of language. Naoko's method bypasses the slow, analytical grammar processing and builds a library of instant conversational building blocks.
And my absolute favorite case study is Andre, an airline pilot based in Brazil. He solved the abundant criteria of Krashen's theory by using a behavioral psychology tactic called stacked habits.
Oh, habit stacking is brilliant.
It is. He would listen to the English audio exclusively while running in the countryside.
Right. It's brilliant because it removes the friction of starting a new routine. If you try to carve out an hour of your day specifically to study English, You will inevitably fail when life gets busy.
Yeah, you just won't do it.
Exactly. But by tethering the cognitive routine listening to English to a deeply ingrained physical routine like running, Andre guaranteed that he would consistently accumulate hundreds of hours of comprehensible input. He essentially automated his own language acquisition.
We've established that video drastically lowers the comprehension threshold because the visual data acts as a crutch for the linguistic data. But what is actually happening on a neurological level when we combine seeing and hearing?
We need to zoom in on the physical brain for that.
Yeah, because this is where learning goes from a theory to a biological reality.
And this is the core of our exploration into dual coding theory. Alan Pivio, a cognitive psychologist, introduced this framework in 1971, and it completely redefined how we understand memory storage.
Let's break down Pivio's architecture. He theorized that the human brain doesn't just have one giant bucket for memories. It actually operates two distinct, parallel, but highly interconnected processing systems. First, you have the verbal system. This handles everything related to language, speech, text, auditory input. Pivio called the units of storage in this system logogens.
Right, and logogens are sequential. When you read a sentence or hear a spoken word, the information is processed linearly, one unit after another.
The second system is the imagistic, or nonverbal system. This handles spatial relationships, visual imagery, and sensory experiences. The storage units here are called imagens.
Imagens, right.
And unlike logogens, imagens are processed synchronously. You take in an entire visual scene all at once, in a fraction of a second.
The breakthrough of dual coding theory is what happens when these two systems are forced to interact. If I give you a vocabulary word on a blank flashcard, you are only encoding a logogen. You have created one fragile pathway to that memory. If that pathway decays over time, the memory is lost.
But if I teach you the idiom pipe dream, and simultaneously show you a vivid, absurd image of an antique opium pipe blowing a cloud of smoke shaped like a mansion, I am activating both systems. I am forcing the brain to encode the logogen and the imagen simultaneously.
You are building a suspension bridge with two massive steel cables instead of one. If the verbal cable snaps, if you simply forget the word in the middle of a conversation, the visual cable is still holding the bridge up. Your brain can access the image of the pipe, which then triggers the retrieval of the verbal word.
And this isn't just a metaphor. When neuroscientists put subjects into fMRI machines and look at the electrical and metabolic activity of the brain, they can physically see dual coding happening.
It's incredible to see.
The left hemisphere, which typically handles the heavy lifting for language processing in the frontal and temporal cortex, lights up. But simultaneously, the right hemisphere and the visual processing centers in the occipital lobe at the back of the brain start firing.
The entire brain is engaged in a synchronized dance. The corpus callosum, which is the thick band of nerve fibers connecting the two hemispheres, is rapidly transmitting data back and forth, cementing the memory across multiple neural networks.
Our sources cite that employing dual coding can boost memory retention by up to 65%.
65%?
That is a staggering number. If you are an educator or a student, a 65% increase in retention is the difference between failing a course and mastering a subject.
It is a massive advantage, but we have to contextualize that 65% figure.
Okay, what's the catch?
Well, it represents the high end of outcomes in controlled studies comparing text-only learning to highly optimized text plus illustration learning. The effectiveness entirely depends on the quality of the visual stimulus.
I see.
A generic, unrelated stock photo placed next to a paragraph of text does not trigger a 65% boost. The imagen must be deeply conceptually congruent with the logogen.
To understand why the visual system is so dominant in this equation, we have to look at the evolutionary biology behind the picture superiority effect. Yeah. I read the study cited in the sources, and it absolutely broke my brain.
Oh, it's a crazy study. But from an evolutionary standpoint, the imagistic system is ancient.
Right.
Early hominids needed to navigate complex spatial environments, remember the locations of predators and water sources, and recognize faces long before they ever developed complex syntax. Human language, in the grand timeline of evolution, is a very recent software update.
Our visual hard drive is just infinitely larger than our verbal hard drive. The study you're referring to demonstrates this perfectly. Researchers took human subjects and showed them 10,000 different photographs.
10,000?
Not 100. 10,000. They flashed each photo on a screen for just 5 seconds. Days later, they tested the subject's recall, and their recognition accuracy was around 83%.
It is a feat of memory that is just impossible to replicate with language. If you showed a human being 10,000 isolated vocabulary words for 5 seconds each, their retention days later would be statistically indistinguishable from 0.
Wow.
The visual well is simply deeper and wider.
So, knowing that the visual system is a superpower, how do we actively harness it? Because the source from Neurosity lays out a critical caveat. They state 2 rules: combine, don't replace, and generate, don't just receive.
Combine, don't replace means that an image alone is useless for learning a specific concept, just as text alone is weak.
Right.
But generate, don't just receive is the real secret. It is the core of active learning.
If I can use an analogy, it's the difference between looking at an IKEA instruction manual and actually physically building the bookshelf yourself.
Yes.
If I hand you a beautifully illustrated textbook, you are passively receiving someone else's dual coding.
Yeah.
But if you read a complex concept, close the book, and physically draw a diagram of it in the margins with your own hand, you are generating the visual.
Exactly. By drawing it, you are forcing your brain to translate the abstract verbal concept into a spatial reality. You engage the motor cortex to move the pen, the visual cortex to analyze the drawing, and the language centers to label it. It becomes a deeply entrenched multisensory memory trace.
And when you take that actively generated dual coding and pair it with spaced repetition, the practice of reviewing the material at systematically increasing intervals over weeks and months, the retention rates become practically permanent.
Spaced, dual-coded review yields 50% to 60% higher long-term retention than masked, single-coded review.
That's huge.
That is the biological difference between cramming for a test and forgetting it the next day versus permanently acquiring a new language.
But knowing that the brain desperately needs comprehensible, visually dual-coded input doesn't really solve the behavioral problem. We live in an era of infinite distraction.
We do.
How do you get a human being to actually sit down and pay attention to this input for more than 10 seconds? If you're a digital educator, you are competing against the entire internet.
You're competing against TikTok, Instagram, everything.
Exactly. Which brings us to the dark arts of audience retention. Let's look at the actual scriptwriting architecture that top YouTube creators use to hijack human attention.
The sources provide a clinical breakdown of a 6-part YouTube script structure. This isn't theoretical. This is the specific blueprint used by channels that have managed to jump their audience retention from a baseline of 25% up to a massive 60% or higher.
Okay, let's go through it. Step 1 is the absolute life or death moment of the video, the hook. This is the first 0 to 30 seconds. The sources call this the click confirmation.
Click confirmation, I like that.
Yeah, when a viewer clicks a thumbnail, they are taking a micro risk with their time. Your only job in the first 10 seconds is to aggressively confirm that their risk was justified.
Which means violating every instinct you have from traditional public speaking.
Right.
You must never, ever introduce yourself. The viewer does not care who you are yet. If you start with, hey guys, welcome back to my channel, my name is John, you have already lost 40% of the audience.
Instead, you have to weaponize curiosity by opening a massive information gap. You immediately state the stakes. You show them the mountain, but you hide the path to get there.
Give an example.
For example, most YouTube creators lose 60% of their audience in the first 30 seconds, but there is a single bizarre sentence that fixes it instantly.
That is a perfect information gap. The brain perceives a deficit in its knowledge and literally releases dopamine to motivate the viewer to close that gap. They have to know the sentence.
Once you have them hooked by the dopamine, part 2 is the context bridge. This is where you rapidly establish your credibility and frame why the problem actually matters to them personally.
And then part 3 is the body, or what retention engineers call the slippery slide.
The slippery slide.
This is where you deliver the core educational value. But here's the trick. You cannot just list facts like a textbook. Every time you answer one question, the answer itself must organically open a new loop.
It's a fractal of curiosity. You solve the macro problem, but create a micro mystery. The viewer never reaches a point where they feel completely satiated until the very end.
Part 4 is the internal call to action, or CTA. This is a natural conversational pause in the middle of the delivery where you ask a highly specific question.
And this isn't just to be friendly, right?
No, not at all. It's an algorithmic trigger designed to drive comments and signal high engagement to the platform.
Got it. Part 5 is the outro CTA. You've delivered the value, and now you convert that captured attention into a long-term subscription by offering a highly specific promise of future value.
Right.
Finally, part 6 is the end screen, visually directing them to the next video to trap them inside your content ecosystem.
But the architecture of attention goes far beyond the written words. It is deeply tied to the visual pacing. Our sources analyzed 100 of the top long-form educational channels and identified a hyper-specific editing pattern called the progressive rhythm.
I found this fascinating because it perfectly mirrors the psychology of a first date. Well, you start tight and fast. In the first 3 minutes of a video, while the viewer is still deciding if they trust you, there's a visual change, a camera angle cut, a zoom in, a pop-up graphic every 10 to 20 seconds. It forces the eye to stay engaged.
But once you cross that threshold, once the viewer is fully invested in the narrative, the pacing fundamentally changes. It widens out. The cuts extend to 25, 30, or even 40 seconds. Creators like Ali Abdaal or Veritasium use this masterfully to allow for calm, complex, deep dive explanations.
However, you can't just leave a single shot up forever. The sources dictate the necessity of a pattern interrupt every 90 seconds.
Right. The 90-second rule is tied to the brain's habituation mechanism.
Habituation.
Yeah, the brain naturally filters out constant, unchanging stimuli to save energy. It's why you don't actively feel the socks on your feet all day.
Oh, that makes sense.
If a video remains visually static for too long, the brain habituates to it and the viewer's mind wanders. A pattern interrupt, a sudden B-roll cut, a jarring sound effect, a shift in lighting forces the brain to reevaluate the environment and resets the attention span.
Okay, but I have to push back on this entire philosophy of hyper-editing. If we look at the dominance of vertical video formats like TikTok or Shorts, the progressive rhythm doesn't exist. It is just a relentless assault of cuts every 3 to 5 seconds.
True.
Doesn't this completely fry the viewer's working memory? If we were trying to teach English idioms, doesn't a cut every 3 seconds cause massive extraneous cognitive overload?
It is a critical concern, and you are absolutely right. The hyperkinetic pacing of short-form vertical video is highly detrimental to deep learning. The key insight from the media optimization framework is that the pacing must serve the pedagogy, not the algorithm.
Form must follow function.
Exactly. A 9.16 vertical video is an entertainment delivery mechanism designed for quick dopamine hits. But horizontal, long-form educational content requires cognitive space.
Right.
If you are introducing a complex, dual-coded concept, the brain physically needs seconds of unbroken processing time to consolidate the logogen and the imagen into long-term memory. If you hit them with a jump cut while they are processing, you shatter the memory trace.
So we have two specific script protocols from the Flicky source that try to balance this retention with actual education. First, for educational content, they recommend the 2134 protocol, which sounds like a football play, but it's a brilliant restructuring of information.
It really is.
You do not start your video with your best point. You start with your second best point as the hook.
This is a retention strategy. If you give away the absolute best information in the first 30 seconds, there is no reason to keep watching.
Right.
By starting with a strong but secondary point, you hook them. Then you immediately follow it with your absolute best point to create a massive retention spike, convincing the viewer that the entire video is packed with elite-level value.
And for narrative or story-based content, the sources point to a classic literary device, starting in media res. This is Latin for in the midst of things.
Right.
You don't start the video by explaining the backstory. You start the video right in the middle of the highest action, the highest tension, the explosion. And then, once the viewer is completely disoriented and invested, you flash back to explain how you got there.
It is Hollywood screenwriting methodology applied directly to digital education.
So we have the linguistic vocabulary, we have the neurology of comprehensible input and dual coding, and we have the structural architecture of audience retention. But a perfectly paced, dual-coded script is still just a sterile piece of engineering.
It's missing something.
A script without a soul is just a robot lecturing you. How do we make the input truly compelling, as Krashen demanded?
According to the cognitive psychology sources, the ultimate catalyst for learning is not structural, it is emotional. The answer is laughter.
Let's dissect the science of instructional humor. Because it's not just about making people smile. Laughter actually alters the chemical state of the brain to facilitate learning.
The sources reference the relational process model of humor, or the RPMH. This model proves that humor actively dismantles what linguists call the affective filter.
The affective filter is essentially a physiological wall of anxiety.
Exactly. Right? When a student is terrified of making a mistake or stressed about conjugate verbs, their amygdala triggers a low-level fight-or-flight response. The brain locks down.
Wow.
No matter how perfect your I+1 input is, if the affective filter is up, the language bounces right off.
But genuine laughter bypasses the amygdala. It reduces cortisol levels and floods the brain with endorphins and dopamine.
Right.
This neurochemical shift not only obliterates the affective filter, but it actively stimulates divergent thinking, allowing the brain to make broader, more creative connections between concepts, which directly improves recall.
But the sources are very careful to distinguish between different types of humor because not all laughter is conducive to learning. They break it down into 4 distinct styles: affiliative, self-enhancing, aggressive, and self-defeating.
Let's start with affiliative. That's the gold standard for educators, right?
Yes. It is the humor of inclusion. It's sharing relatable, lighthearted observations that build a social bond between the teacher and the learner.
And self-enhancing.
Self-enhancing humor is closely related. It's the ability to maintain a positive, humorous outlook in the face of stress or mistakes, modeling resilience for the student.
But then you have the dark side, aggressive humor. This is sarcasm, biting, teasing, or making the student the butt of the joke.
Aggressive humor is catastrophic in an educational environment.
Why?
Even if the rest of the class is laughing, the target of the joke experiences a massive spike in anxiety. The affective filter slams shut. Furthermore, the tension created in the room increases the extraneous cognitive load for everyone else because they are now worried about being the next target instead of focusing on the material.
There's also a crucial structural distinction between integrated and contiguous humor. Contiguous humor is what bad public speakers do.
Oh, we've all seen it.
They walk up to the podium and tell a random, unrelated joke about a priest and a rabbi to get a laugh, and then they start a boring lecture on economics. It doesn't aid learning because the laughter is totally disconnected from the material.
For humor to act as a memory aid, it must be integrated. The joke must rely on the target concept.
Going back to our vocabulary, if you are teaching the phrase pipe dream, and you show a visual of a guy smoking a pipe while staring at a blueprint for a time machine, and you make a pun about how his plans are going up in smoke that is integrated, the humor anchors the linguistic concept in the brain.
Which brings us to the most fascinating practical application of all these theories combined: modeling natural, spontaneous speech using a comedy structure known as the double act.
If we want learners to transition from reading rigid textbook English to understanding the messy, chaotic reality of everyday conversation, we have to expose them to authentic conversational dynamics.
Right.
The sources provide a brilliant script breakdown from an ESL podcast utilizing 3 characters: Luke, the host and teacher, George, acting as the straight man, and Sam, acting as the funny man.
The double act is a century-old comedy structure, but its application in language acquisition is genius. George, the straight man, represents the anchor of reality. He speaks in standard, grammatically correct sentences. He relies on logic.
And Sam, the funny man, is an agent of pure chaos.
Oh.
In the specific example provided, Sam is earnestly pitching a business idea to build a luxury spa for pigeons in the middle of the city,
A literal pigeon spa.
complete with tiny robes.
The pedagogical brilliance here is that because Sam's premise is so utterly absurd, George is forced to genuinely react. He cannot rely on a pre-written, sterile dialogue tree.
Right.
He has to jump in, interrupt, challenge the premise, and correct Sam's logic.
By doing so, George is organically modeling the exact colloquial English that textbooks completely ignore. He is forced to use conversational repair strategies. He has to use back-channeling, saying, wait, what? Or, hold on a second, to manage the flow of the argument. He is modeling how to politely tell someone their idea is completely unhinged.
It creates a colloquialness bridge. A real human communication is not a perfect exchange of complete sentences. It is full of false starts, emotional fluctuations, pauses, and overlapping speech.
Exactly.
When George tells Sam that the pigeon spa is an absolute pipe dream, the listener absorbs the idiom not as a vocabulary flashcard, but as a weapon of conversational logic. They learn the rhythm, the tone, and the context simultaneously.
It is the ultimate fusion of creation's compelling input, dual coding's active engagement, and the attention architecture of a perfectly paced script.
It proves that to teach a language effectively, you have to stop teaching the language and start having a wildly entertaining conversation that just happens to be in that language.
Let's pull the lens back and look at the massive terrain we've covered today. We started by defining the fundamental difference between the passive emotional state of a dream and the active structural reality of a goal, unpacking idioms from reaching for the stars to chasing a pipe dream.
We dismantled the rote memorization of behaviorism and embraced the biology of the language acquisition device, proving that comprehensible, compelling input is the only way to feed the brain.
We looked at the neurological hardware of dual coding theory, visualizing how logging words and generating images builds a dual cable suspension bridge in the brain, capable of increasing long-term retention by 65%.
We reverse engineered the YouTube algorithm, breaking down the hooks, the information gaps, and the progressive rhythm required to hijack human attention long enough for that dual coding to actually occur.
And finally, we explored how affiliative humor and the comedic friction of a double act dissolve the affective filter, turning a stressful grammar lesson into a masterclass in colloquial fluency. So whether you are trying to master English, trying to build an audience for your own digital content, or simply trying to understand the psychological mechanisms acting upon you every time you open an app, you now possess the blueprint. You can take your own educational ambitions, your own pipe dreams, and actively engineer them into reality.
But as we close this exploration, there is one final, almost unsettling avenue of speculation we need to consider.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we have spent this entire time discussing optimization, retention engineering, perfectly paced, dual-coded, flawlessly scripted delivery. As artificial intelligence systems become exponentially better at generating these optimal scripts, synthesizing the perfect hook, the exact I+1 vocabulary, and the mathematically perfect visual pacing, will that pristine, frictionless perfection eventually become entirely boring to the human brain?
Oh, that is a profound thought. If the GPS map is absolutely perfect, does the brain just fall asleep at the wheel?
Exactly. Could it be that our natural, messy human flaws, the times we stutter, the spontaneous tangents we go on, the unscripted moments where an affiliative joke completely derails the conversation, could those flaws actually become the ultimate pattern interrupt? In a future completely saturated with mathematically perfect AI content, will genuine human imperfection be the only thing that keeps a learner's attention?
It's the friction that makes the journey memorable. The map might be clear, the GPS might finally be working, but it's the unscripted stumbles along the way that actually wire the experience into our souls. Keep chasing your ambitious goals, keep analyzing the hidden architecture of the media you consume, and embrace the friction of learning. Until next time, keep diving deep.